As you leave the west end of London and Bayswater Road meets Notting Hill Gate, a huge concrete brutalist grid looms into view, strikingly different from the opulent Victorian architecture all around. As you get closer to it, you find that everything on the facade is executed in the same rigorous concrete with an irregular pattern of windows and recessions. At one point the windows disappear from the grid, and you can see a roof garden and concrete water tanks through the open space. As you walk around, you'll find abstract sculptures and gardens as the building meets the street. This is hard-line, high modernism, radically unlike the sort of thing you expect to see in an affluent area like this. How did it get here? This building was built as the Czech and Slovak Embassy. Today it accommodates the separate Slovak and Czech embassies, along with other agencies such as the Czech Centre with its window gallery.
These buildings are the Czech and Slovak embassies, built between 1965 and 1971 as the Czechoslovak Embassy and divided into two in 1993 when the two countries split. The designers were Jan Šrámek, Jan Bočan and Karel Štěpánský, who made up Studio Beta, an architectural cooperative based in Prague. The interiors, designed with Zdeněk Rothbauer, were filled with sculpture, glassware and other artworks by Czech and Slovak artists. The Czech and Slovak architects on the original building were assisted on the ground by the firm of Robert Matthew Johnson Marshall, who were the designers of the Commonwealth Institute, now the Design Museum on the other side of Holland Park, and were also among the designers of the Royal Festival Hall. This collaboration between modern architects on either side of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War was completely unique at the time for British buildings of any kind. And as interest in this period increases, it's worth trying to find out exactly how this extraordinary building came about. We're now going to enter the Czech Embassy, which was originally the administrative and residential quarters for the Czech and Slovak Embassy. The federal state of Czechoslovakia, which came into being after 1918, after the First World War, was one of the global kind of centres of modern architecture in the 1920s and 1930s. The modern materials, the clean lines, the flowing spaces, and the kind of new sense of scale of the so-called international style was enormously appealing to architects in this new multinational state. The new inner suburbs and public buildings of cities like Prague, Brno, Bratislava are full of modern buildings of a scale far beyond anything which was seen in Britain before 1945. The largest of them, like the Trade Fair Palace built in the centre of Prague in the mid-1920s, have a sense of scale, and sort of vastness and repetition and a use of concrete, which are very comparable to some of the ideas in the Czech and Slovak embassies, and compares more with the utopian projects of Russian constructivism. We're now in the reception area of the Czech embassy, and we're now going to go down the stairs to the original cinema of the combined Czech and Slovak embassy. We're now in the basement, in the lobby for the cinema. These here are the cloakrooms with specially designed keys. And now we're going to the cinema. So we're now in the cinema, which at the time the building was the Czech and Slovak Embassy, would have been used by dignitaries, embassy staff, probably people from the fraternal republics. But as you can see, has been fairly recently refurbished and is still in use, screening films. Going back to the story of the building, the Czech and Slovak Embassy was not the first Czechoslovak building to be built in Britain. Several decades before, in 1932, the architects of the Bata Company built East Tilbury, a company town for the Bata Shoe Company, based on their much larger city of Zlín in Moravia, which unified kind of work and life and housing and leisure facilities and factories all in the same very hard line, flat-roofed, white-walled modernism. After 1938, as the Czech lands were gradually annexed by Nazi Germany, many architects emigrated, some of them to Britain, such as the Slovak architect Eugene Rosenberg, who had worked on the Pensions Institute in Prague and would later become a major designer with his firm York, Rosenberg and Mardal of buildings for the National Health Service, such as St Thomas's Hospital on the south bank of the Thames, which with its use of ceramic tiles, its sort of large scale and minimalism and its use of modern sculpture, in this case by Naum Garbo, has a lot in common both for the Pensions Institute and for the Czech and Slovak Embassy. The modern architecture that Czechoslovakia had specialised in was suppressed by Nazi Germany, and after 1948, for several years, it was also suppressed by the new communist government. Instead, the new government imported the bombastic, neoclassical, retro design of socialist realism. By the early 50s, the cities of Central and Eastern Europe were no longer the centres of modern design that they had been before 1939. This started to change in the mid-1950s after two speeches by the new Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, not just the famous 1956 secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes, but also a 1954 speech denouncing Stalin's architecture. By the time the Czech and Slovak embassies were built in the 1960s, a new generation of modern architects who had been taught by that pre-war generation of modernists had started to strike out on their own with a new kind of Czechoslovak architecture. The first showcase of this new Czechoslovak architecture abroad was at Expo 1958 in Brussels. The building there, a glass pavilion with a glass rotunda restaurant, was actually the most popular pavilion of Expo 1958, had the most visitors, had the most praise, and eventually won the gold medal for finest pavilion of that famous expo, largely because of its program of applied art, such as the glassware of René Rubacek, or the Laterna Magica puppet theatre, which combined with the modern design had a great deal of effect on the expo's millions of visitors. The building's cafe still stands in the hills above Prague, where it is now an advertising agency. The expo building showed an interest in integrating architecture and abstract art, something which can be seen all over the Czech and Slovak embassies. Every 1960s concrete building has to have its own underground car park, and we're now going to go to the one in the Czech embassy. By the mid-1960s, this new Czechoslovak architecture was being exported around the world in a series of newly designed embassies. These were designed in cities from some considerable distance from Prague, such as New Delhi, Brasilia, and Beijing, but probably the three most famous are in London, Berlin, and Stockholm. The Berlin embassy, by the husband and wife team of Vladimir and Vera Machonin, is particularly dramatic, a kind of huge brutalist building in the centre of Berlin. But the Stockholm and London designs were rather more modest and subtle, and were by the designs of the Studio Beta team of Bochan, Schramek, and Szczepanski. The richly modelled concrete surfaces of the Stockholm and London embassies showed the influence of brutalism, which poses the question of why this particular very aggressive, very kind of tactile architecture was so appealing as a way of showcasing Czechoslovak architecture abroad. An answer to this was given by the interior designer for the London Embassy, Zdeněk Rothbauer. In architecture, he said, the rule was for buildings to represent the high level of the socialist society. They were to be equal to the buildings of the Western neighbours. Everything was intended to be an advertisement for this society. However, these buildings were designed by independent teams, such as Studio Beta, who had been given considerable autonomy in the mid-1960s, this being very much part of the socialism of the human face of the mid-1960s that was so violently crushed in August 1968. So we're now on the 5th floor of the residential and administrative block, now the Czech Embassy, which is where the building's original canteen was and where it still is, in there. And here there's a roof terrace. The Czech and Slovak Embassy was begun in 1966 at the very start of the process of socialism of the human face. The architects had worked at the state-owned design firm and building firm Stavro Projekt, in which capacity they had worked on new factories and new towns in countries such as Mali and Sudan. Because of this, the architects were used to representing Czechoslovak design and ideology to the world, but not in doing so in a Western European city like London. But according to Jan Bochan, the architects aimed to create a masterpiece that would represent the nation, but not necessarily the group that was then in power. Although the building was finally finished and opened in 1971, 3 years after the crushing of the Prague Spring, it remains very much a product of that earlier era. However, the building was taken very seriously by its architects and by its clients. And one way that you can tell the difference between the rigour and discipline of this building and a lot of the commercial modernism that was common in a city like London at the time is by looking around at a lot of the other buildings in Notting Hill Gate, which had been designed as part of the comprehensive redevelopment of the area by the commercial architects Cotton, Ballard and Blow. Their kind of flimsier surfaces and cheap cladding contrasts a great deal with the massive concrete integrity of the Czech and Slovak embassies. Roof terraces like this were very popular in brutalist buildings, on the example of Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, which had a kind of roof garden for its residents, where the water tanks were kind of modelled into almost kind of concrete sculptures, something that you can see very much around here. Notting Hill, at the time that this building was being built, was an area that was changing very, very rapidly, and an area which was then, as it very much is now, polarised between areas that were very wealthy and areas that were not, and areas that were increasingly kind of modern in design and areas which weren't. And you can see that in this site here, where over there you have Trellick Tower in Ladbroke Grove, one of the kind of most famous brutalist social housing complexes in Europe at the time. But just behind us, out of shot, you have Kensington Palace Gardens, the still private kind of home of lots of London's aristocracy. We also have, in that direction, the comprehensive redevelopment, so-called, by commercial architects and developers in Notting Hill, by the architects Cotton, Ballard and Blow, lots of which, unlike the Czech and Slovak Embassy, has been demolished, partly because of its fairly poor build quality. The roof terrace is one of the places you can really see a lot of the kind of motifs of the brutalist design of this building. The towers themselves, again, because the way they're sort of designed almost like sculptures, have this kind of giant, very dramatic feel, almost like turrets. You can see also here in the kind of concrete, I suppose, what would you call these? Awnings. Some of the kind of imaginative ideas in the design. And you can also see the kind of surface of the concrete, which is different for all the different parts of the building. You know, there's parts where you can see more of the stone aggregate, parts where it's smoother. It's sort of different at each level. One of the flats of the embassy, of the kind of residential parts of it, is actually in one of the water tanks. Obviously lots of the building is actually residential. It was built as, and still is, often flats for embassy staff and diplomats and so on. And we're now going to have a look at some of these flats and some of the spaces around them. So we're now in one of the flats in the residential part of the embassy with these original 1960s cupboards with their original 1960s sock drawers.
The Czech Embassy underwent extensive refurbishment in 2016 and 2017, and although there were no significant structural changes, the interiors are mostly not original, except for the cupboards, doors, staircases and wooden partitions, which use different kinds of exotic wood veneer.
So I'm now in one of the kind of main public-facing areas of the embassy. There's a bar over there, there's this big open space here, and this is very much where, you know, kind of occasions, functions and so on would have taken place. But over here is a sculptural wall by the sculptor Stanislav Kolíbal, which you might have spotted the other side of at the start, walking down Notting Hill Gate. So if you explore the building, both inside and out, you kind of start to notice the way that kind of integrated sculpture and artworks go alongside this kind of sense of everything being made from the same material and the sense of kind of concrete brutalist mass. Probably the artwork that does this most of all is Kolíbal's wall. So the exterior is much smoother, almost kind of white concrete, designed to be seen by people walking down Notting Hill Gate at speed, you know, kind of quickly kind of going past this sculpture and kind of glimpsing it straight away. Whereas this was obviously for people that were, you know, spending hours here or working here, you know, who actually had much more opportunity to kind of explore this sculpture and linger on it. So the surface is much more sort of differentiated, much more complex. Kolíbal actually, you know, came to the site, came to London and worked on this particular part of the sculpture of a jackhammer, and that's why it has this incredibly kind of rough, grainy, almost kind of like organic look about it, whereas the front is more sort of smooth and machine-made and rippling. So I'm coming out now of the Czech Embassy, as it now is, and into the garden between what's now the Czech and Slovak Embassies. I'm also going from one sculpture by Stanislav Kolíbal inside to another in the garden. So this sculpture of Kolíbal's separated matter isn't sort of integrated into the building in the same way as the wall, and it's just more of a sort of freestanding sculpture in a garden, here with this concrete plinth and with this kind of metal structure, much kind of closer to the sculpture of the interwar years, a kind of constructivist sculpture that was particularly popular in Czechoslovakia in the 20s and 30s. And behind us is the Slovak Embassy. So in the garden you can kind of get a sense of the facades of the buildings. Here at the kind of residential administrative block, the Czech Embassy, you can get much more of a kind of sense of how the flats are integrated with the roof terrace, and here you can see those sculptural water tanks really well, and how the kind of the grid of the building kind of recedes at one corner, showing the roof garden and where that goes. Whereas here you have the kind of back end of what's now the Slovak Embassy, which was originally very much the kind of public part of the Czechoslovak Embassy. It was the part that was most sort of visited, the part that kind of was sort of the main entrance. And you can sort of see that in a way by the way that the building's much more sort of dynamically composed. This kind of rhythm of the windows kind of sloping inward within the grid, setting up this kind of very rhythmic facade. Also the way that the kind of corrugated concrete alternates with the smoother concrete on the concrete panels of the facade. It's kind of much more sort of outward facing and has much more kind of glass on the facade and so on. The Slovak Embassy is also the part of the building that has the most surviving original interiors, and it's that we're going to go and visit now. Whereas the Czech part of the embassy faces the kind of busy street of Notting Hill Gate, what's now the Slovak Embassy, the kind of original main entrance of the combined building, is on Kensington Palace Gardens, a private kind of royally owned street full of embassies and grand houses that is probably the single poshest spot in the whole of London. I think there's something to be said for an era when you could build a sort of gigantic concrete building in the middle of a place like that. So we're now in the main hall of what's now the Slovak Embassy, which is still used as a space for exhibitions and other public events. And it's probably the part of the building where you can see most the way that the kind of this sort of quite functionalist architecture and the artworks kind of intersect and clash in the most interesting way. The Slovak Embassy is currently being renovated, so we can't show you that much of it, but what we can show you is the chandelier by René Rubacek, the glassmaker and sculptor who won the main prize at Expo 58. And the kind of explosive, organic, kind of really quite sort of wild nature of that chandelier or of that artwork, depending on how you want to look at it, is a kind of reminder of the surrealist tradition, something which was always very strong in Czechoslovakia when it existed, in filmmaking and in artwork and so forth. And obviously one of the main surrealist values is juxtaposition. It's kind of throwing together things that shouldn't necessarily usually go together. In this case, this kind of sort of wild and bizarre kind of sort of futurist organic chandelier in amongst this kind of quite kind of functionalist public hall. One of the side effects of the breaking up of one embassy into two after 1993 is that some parts of the building are connected with parts of the other building. So here behind me are the cloakrooms of the cinema, which are in the Slovak Embassy, whereas the cinema itself is in the Czech Embassy. Probably the most surreal of all of the spaces in the original Czechoslovak Embassy is the mezzanine of the Slovak Embassy. A dining and meeting space which has some of the qualities of a 1960s science fiction film. The juxtaposition here of this kind of aristocratic Rococo furniture in this kind of enclosed concrete space, as if you've sort of been beamed from one time to the other and the time machine hasn't quite worked properly. It's a really extraordinary and strange space, a real kind of sort of truly surrealist space, I think. It's also a good place to kind of contemplate what happened to this building and what happened to some of the people who were involved in it after 1968. So despite the change of regime in August 1968, the embassy itself wasn't actually affected. The design was carried out as originally planned, and none of the architects were specifically repressed. Also, although quite a lot of architects from Czechoslovakia emigrated in 1968, in many cases to Britain, such as Eva Juričná, Dalibor Vesely, Jan Kapličky. The architects of the embassy didn't. They continued working after 1968 in Czechoslovakia. But nonetheless, I think the building kind of stands much more as a sort of monument to those 1960s ideas than to the so-called normalization of the 70s. There's nothing particularly normal about anything in this building. Although they all went back to work in Czechoslovakia after 1968, the team of Bočan and Šrámek and Štěpánský designed a certain amount of buildings that show, in some ways, a kind of continuation of what they were doing with the London Embassy, but also suggested some of the new ideas they might have found when they were in London. So on the one hand, the Hotel Intercontinental in Prague has a sort of similar sense of sort of brutalist mass and scale and aggression to the Czechoslovak Embassy's facade onto Notting Hill Gate. And similarly, it was a building that was very much supposed to showcase modern Czechoslovak design to visitors from abroad as a luxury hotel. But what's probably more interesting is to look at their involvement in the design of the main railway station in Prague, a controversial project of the 1970s. And this building, with its kind of use of sort of bright colours and futuristic kind of colours and shapes, and also the kind of almost sort of disco kind of feel of a lot of that building, you can maybe see some of their acquaintance with Swinging London, if you want to see it like that. But you can also see, I think, the influence of the pop architecture and the high-tech architecture, which they would have encountered in the late 1960s in London, being taken back with them to Prague. After 1989, Jan Bočan went back to designing embassies, including the new embassy of the Czech Republic in Georgia, a much more sort of lightweight environmentalist green design that was opened in the mid-2000s. But it's a much more heavy and aggressive and futuristic and strange work of the 1960s, for which he and his team will probably be best remembered. In the last decade or so, the architecture of the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s in Central and Eastern Europe has become something of a kind of cult It features on dozens of Instagram accounts and films and books called things like Socialist Modernism or Cosmic Communist Constructions Photographed or Soviet Ghosts or what have you. But what's very frequently not noticed in this cult, which is particularly big in London in many ways, is that there is a huge socialist era Central and Eastern European building right in the centre of London of the very highest quality. Perhaps one reason why the building isn't really noticed, despite the kind of cult of that era, is that it's not really silly enough. This was a building that its architects took very seriously, even in the kind of more sort of strange and humorous spaces like this one. It was designed with a great deal of integrity, and although it's very much a project of the space age, it isn't kind of over the top or bombastic or goofy. It's a very, very serious building designed by architects who very much knew what they were doing. The building was, of course, designed originally to be a representative space to show the world some of the sort of design achievements of communist Czechoslovakia. But the architect, or the lead architect, Jan Bochan, had slightly different ideas about what he was doing with this building, and he commented on this later as follows. I believe, he said, that we managed to partially restore the cultural reputation of our country. That modest ambition has something of the same quality as the building.